You've heard it before and I'll say it again, but this is what the first episode should have ended on. A prologue as captivating as it was entertaining. Despite knowing exactly what was going to happen, I still found myself entranced by the grim situation Sung Jin Woo found himself in. It was the part of solo leveling that to me differentiated this from every other power fantasy. Like, the tame substance of last episode definitely could have been perceived as basic, but it was here in episode 2 that we finally got to see what solo leveling really has to offer. We've still just barely scratched the surface, but if episode 2 had been combined with episode 1, an opening like that honestly would have felt just as impactful as Attack on Titans or Death Note's. I think it would have captured the attention of a lot more people right from the get-go. The setup to Doom then tease of what's to come really was portrayed better than I could have imagined. In fact, a lot of the scenes were a lot more gruesome than how even the manhwa portrayed it. And that's just one of the many differences between the manhwa and anime. The very thing we're going to talk about in this video here. Not only is it a comprehensive review of how the anime was compared to the manhwa though, but it's also a breakdown of the more subtle details left out from the novel. Now, I know many of you have probably read the solo leveling manhwa, but if you're looking to read the original novel for yourself, then the best place to find it is over at Webnovel. As the host of both the webcomic and the novel, Webnovel was kind enough to sponsor this video so that I could tell you about it. Specifically what you're missing out on by not reading solo leveling. So, for starters, there's the unrivaled art style of the manhwa, which to this day is still the best I've seen in any digital media. It's the strongest aspect of solo leveling as a whole, and it really just makes the reading experience that much more enjoyable. Seriously. Even if the story wasn't as exciting as it was already, I'd still recommend the manhwa based on that single aspect alone. It truly is something to experience whether now or after the anime. Then for those who've read the manhwa all the way to completion, there's plenty more about the world to be discovered through the novels. Just like how I mentioned in my last video, whether it be motivations for why Sung Jin Woo became a hunter, or more detailed world building behind dungeons and guilds, the fascinating elements that make solo leveling so captivating are all fleshed out more. It's a much more in-depth look into Sung Jin Woo and his level up process. So, whether you're anime only or a manhwa veteran, both the manhwa and novel have something worth checking out, and both are available right here on Webnovel. It's by far the best and easiest way to consume this amazing power fantasy. All you gotta do is download the app or visit their website, then simply type in solo leveling into the search bar. You can also click my link in the description to go right to it. It'll be the first of many other power fantasies you'll find just like it there. An insanely massive library dedicated to webcomics and novels of that exact genre. So that's where you can read solo leveling, but now let's talk about the anime. Episode 2, If I Had One More Chance, covering chapters 4 to 10 of the webcomic and chapters 4 to 7 of the web novel. This first little bit actually relates to the previous episode, but one of the biggest differences between the manhwa and anime here is the addition of this dagger for Sung Jin Woo during his raids. It wasn't something that he actually had available to him. Now, that may not seem like that big of a deal at first, but when you realize the implication is that Sung had done every raid with no weapon at all, it really makes you understand just how courageous he's been. I mean, it's one thing to confront a literal demon when you can use a sword, but to do so with nothing but the hands that you were born with, well, that's a whole nother feat that requires more than just bravery. It was all because Sung was committed to saving as much money as possible. He never invested any into buying a weapon because to him he felt it would just end up breaking anyway. So as long as the only thing to break was always his body, Sung knew he could just get healed and keep going hunting again. It was a mindset that not only highlighted his commitment to saving money, but at the same time also showed just how much risk he was putting on himself. Keep in mind, Sung definitely isn't a professional fighter, so to find out that he was straight throwing hands with every monster he was up against, well, that makes his feats a lot more impressive no matter how weak he is. He was quite literally boxing for every essence crystal that he came across. This didn't really work in his favor with the other hunters though, since to them not only did this highlight Sung's weakness as a hunter, but the injuries he sustained while doing so also doubled the workload of their healers. He was very quickly viewed more as a nuisance than an asset, a low-rank tagalong that eventually became known as the weakest. Another subtle difference between the manhwa and the anime was the condescending look the statue quite visibly had over everyone. In the anime, it was more this neutral, I'm just a statue type face, whereas every panel from the manhwa made it seem like the statue was looking down on them. There was this clear disdain in its gaze here that I feel the anime didn't really capture in the beginning. The later smile was a whole different emotion. I feel it animated perfectly, but the expressions leading up to that could have been a bit more intimidating. Now, it was after the laser beam was fired that of the 16 hunters alive, only 11 were remaining after. Had Sung reacted 1/100th of a second later, then he too would have been on that list of casualties. It was in the novels that he was about to get back up right after, but just before he could, that's when Mr. Sung prevented him. By using the one good arm he had left, he had forced Sung back down and ordered the rest to do the same. Now, I know that's an order we saw him give in the anime, but by having that additional part where he helps out Sung as well, it really goes to highlight just how much of a veteran he is. Despite losing his arm only a mere few seconds ago, he had quickly composed himself and started looking out for others. He neither descended into panic nor focused solely on himself, but instead continued to lead and focused on everyone else's survival. It was the true mark of someone who's been a hunter for over 10 years now. To continue speaking to that experience, the reason he knew this dungeon was A rank or S rank was because out of all the B rank dungeons he'd done throughout his career, not a single monster had ever been capable of one-shotting someone. It was a phenomenon he knew could only happen in the highest rank dungeons. Since he believed this one to be super easy though, one of the things he mentioned only in the manhwa was that he had thought 3 healers would be more than adequate for this. With one having just been vaporized though, another cowering far away in a corner, then their best Juhi incapable of doing anything anymore. It basically meant anyone who was injured like him was out of luck now. I don't think this was the fault of Songs for not expecting this, but perhaps at least one more experienced healer may have proved valuable here. At the very least, one who wouldn't crack under the pressure like this. There was a bit more freaking out for those who remained after this, then the runner Ju was revealed to be what's called a close combat hunter. These were the types of hunters who possessed far superior physical abilities to regular humans and as such would always be the ones to jump right into combat. Sung Jin Woo was one of these as well, but unfortunately for him, he wasn't as blessed as all the other close combat hunters. Now, a subtle change specific to the novels after this was another beam attack that happened right after Sung stood up for the second time. We know this was him testing to see what would happen, but it was the fact it attacked again but only above a certain height that allowed him to reasonably deduce that staying low was the solution here. He was even able to determine that while low they could move as much as they wanted. The anime and manhwa only showed the statue's eyes start to glow, but I think that by having the statue fully attack again, it makes Sung Jin Woo's jumps in logic make a bit more sense. What I mean is that he was able to visibly see that the laser would only kill him if he was standing above a certain height, thus reinforcing the notion that his previous assumption was true. This paves the path towards a slightly bigger change because it's here that Mr. Kim starts to be depicted rather differently. He wasn't nearly as passive as he was in the anime or manhwa, but was instead becoming increasingly aggressive the more dangerous things became. So, when Sung had suggested that everyone should bow, it was Mr. Kim who was the first to deny him. Sure, many of the other hunters started cursing him as well, but it was Mr. Kim who was without a doubt the most vocal about it. He had even gone so far as to say that if he could stand, he would go and punch Sung just for suggesting that. This was definitely a response fueled by rage, but for them who'd just lost 6 comrades to the statue, it was absurd to think that they could just disregard that and go and bow to it. Combine that with the fact Sung had no proof to what was essentially a guess, and the result was a group of people just not willing to cooperate. I mean, he was after all the weakest person there, and it was until just recently that most, if not all of them, were looking down on him for that. It was only after Song had mentioned that he would do it that the rest would follow suit, albeit reluctantly. To them, the notion of possibly surviving was far more enticing than whatever prideful resentment kept them from doing so. So, initially nothing had happened the first time around, but that was because everyone except for Juhi was bowing. As you would expect, she was stuck in fetal position and couldn't move regardless of what she wanted. She had forced Sung to have to reposition her himself, an act which would finally bring them into the second phase. A minor thing to note about the religious guy was that he wasn't the academic the anime made him out to be, but instead just a random guy who sung in his local church choir. Since that meant praise was something he was familiar with, he believed one of his church hymns might be the answer, resulting in him literally singing to the giant statue walking towards him. The statue had actually come to a full stop right before him, so as a sign that this might actually be working, the man had started singing both louder and more confidently. He had fully embraced the idea that this could very well be the answer. Of course, Sung knew that something was off because if the rule was to praise the god standing before them, then it wouldn't make sense that hymns praising a Christian god would work instead. It was obvious the only outcome was the one where this person got stepped on. Sung did try to turn and help the next girl, but it was before he could even get close that Song would stand in front of him to stop him. You see, to Song it was way too late to do anything for her. The statue was clearly on a mission to kill everyone, and its increasing speed only went to make such a point even more obvious. I'm not just talking about a stroll into a moderately paced walk, but instead a walk into a full-on sprint. That's right, in the novel the statue was described to be running to everyone. It was pretty much as if the colossal titan was straight up dashing towards them. Obviously, animating something like that would be rather difficult, but I think just imagining it gets the point across too. Now, a couple other subtle things to mention about the manhwa is the incredibly expressive faces of despair each of the characters were portrayed with. This was definitely a natural product of single panel versus fluid animation, but since we are comparing all cuts and changes here, I figure showing a few would highlight such a difference. The anime still definitely captured everyone's dread and despair perfectly, but to not show the manhwa's detail would be remiss on my part. There were also a few extra panels showing a lot of the other hunters dying, then Park's flashback was preceded by the fact that he wanted to live the most. It was a belief brought to life by the additional energy he channeled to make himself run faster. Fortunately, this brought him the farthest away from the giant statue first, but unfortunately for him, this also made him the target of the other ones. So it was Park's death and the fact the giant statue was right on his ass that Mr. Kim would break down the moment he arrived at safety. They didn't show him get chased in the anime, but in the novels the statue was only 1 or 2 steps away from reaching him. He was without a doubt the next target chosen for elimination by it. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you just how stressful such a situation could be, but I'm also sure the relief of seeing the statue stop right in front of you would be equally as satisfying. This was the plethora of emotions Mr. Kim was going through. The statue would then shift its focus to the only 2 people left, and this would lead to Sung running blindly as fast as he could to get away from it. The reason he ended up at the shield statue was because he was so focused on the giant statue that was chasing him, as well as the amount of energy he was channeling into his legs in order to run faster, that he didn't even realize he was going in the wrong direction. Had he been paying attention to his surroundings too, then he would have noticed that there wasn't a single instrument statue left at all. This was the last thing on his mind though, as the recent attack from the shield left him teetering on the edge of life and death. It was a game he knew he was always playing, but it was this particular moment that he felt he would finally lose. This was neither mentioned in the novels nor the anime, but in the manhwa it was visualized through a spectral game of tug-of-war. Here we have Sung holding on to the thread of life, yet it's in this moment that it looks as if it's about to snap. So, as Sung called out to whatever god would listen, he would make it to the singing statue and end the second phase. This wasn't before getting stared down intensely by the statue though, since in the novels the giant god was very clearly angered by this. It seemed perturbed by Sung's persistent will to live, and as such expressed its discontent with a face significantly scarier than any it had before. Whatever disdain it exhibited before was now greatly magnified by the fact that Sung got to live here. It was a feeling made apparent by the intimidating stare it held for what seemed like forever. That brings us now to Juhi's futile attempt to heal Sung, which for the most part consisted of every bit of healing magic she had available to her. She was trying every spell she could possibly think of, despite knowing full well that only the higher ranked healers could regenerate limbs like that. So in actuality, all she was doing was pouring out mana, much to the point that it was taking a toll on her vitality now. This was portrayed mainly as bleeding and fatigue, but the way mana exhaustion was described in the novels was significantly worse than how they made it seem here. You see, not only was she unable to move in the moment Sung needed her most, but her lack of vitality became increasingly apparent through the bluing of her lips and the occasional body spasms. They were all side effects that came when someone overused their mana to near emptiness, symptoms that only worsened with her extreme exhaustion. So, I know the anime displayed her as going through it, but I think it is worth noting just how much she really was going through it. It leads us into another character who wasn't quite depicted the way they were in the novels. That of course being Mr. Kim again. I'd mentioned how with every phase he was becoming more and more aggressive. Well, it was here in the third that aggression had come to its forefront. He had taken charge just like how he did in the anime, except the reason for it was because he knew no one could stop him. Since Song was incapacitated without his arm, that made Kim the strongest since he was up there at the top of the D ranks. It had left him feeling like he could force Sung to be the sacrifice everyone thought they needed. I mean, he was after all the one that guilt-tripped them into opening the doors with him. Kim didn't trust that Sung would actually follow through with it though, so as he walked slowly towards the altar in the center, Kim followed close behind, holding his sword to his back just in case. It was an act Sung believed to be the very height of cowardice, one that would have him curse his powerlessness more so now than any time he'd ever felt weak before this. With this being the epitome of injustice, Sung knew that if he had the power to get up and stop Kim himself, then that's exactly what he would have done 5 times over by now. In fact, it was only 2 key things that were preventing him from getting up and trying it anyway. The first was the fact he was a whole rank lower and missing a leg, and the other was the irrational nature of Kim, which could very possibly put Joo-hee in danger. You see, there was a chance that if Sung was to get up and try anything, both him and Joo-hee could become Kim's targets next. Sung was fine with Kim getting hostile towards him, but putting Joo-hee in danger wasn't something he was willing to risk right now. Thus the reason now more than ever he hated how weak he was. Luckily, Sung didn't have to stay upset for long, since as soon as he saw a sacrifice may not even be necessary, his face lit up as he knew he could potentially save Sung now. He didn't have very long to think about it though, since with Joo-hee's condition getting worse, Kim's anger steadily spiraling out of control, then the other hunters quickly losing their senses to fear, it was clear not many more rational decisions were going to be made by everyone. So, Sung acted quickly to get everyone near the altar, and that's when 36 blue lights lit up around them. Each represented 1 minute of a 36-minute timer, and all signified the start of this final test of faith. To provide a bit more clarity on how this was a test of faith, the whole thing essentially came down to the false hope you could see versus the promise they couldn't. The false hope being the wide open door in front of them, and the promise being the ensured path of survival should they prove their faith successfully. It was a conclusion Sung had come to after taking in how the statue's lights and door reacted to them. This, combined with the fact the commandments always provided a way out, made him certain his path forward was the only one. So, when the first person left and the door closed a little bit, that's when Sung knew for sure that the door was a trap. Had they all left the zone when the door had opened, then the door would have closed fully and all of them been trapped forever. It was clear proof that staying put was the only right answer. Now, the thing is, with the statues moving closer and the blue flame still showing 30 minutes left, that was a long time spent trusting that Sung Jin Woo's assumption was accurate. Not only did they have to trust that he was right though, but they also had to trust that the people around them could do their jobs too. Assuming they were set free after those 36 minutes, they still had to keep their cool and maintain watch throughout all of it. So, the question for everyone then was, do I trust Sung and trust my comrades, or do I succumb to temptation and seek out freedom for myself? It was a question to which the answer would determine whether they could prove their faith or not. Would they trust the god killing them was also one who would let them go, or would they break their faith and look out for themselves? Would they trust their fellow hunters and have faith in their ability, or would they break that too and send them straight to their deaths? The whole thing was kinda like this messed up trolley problem. One where if you pull the lever you can save yourself, but by doing so you're also sending the trolley to kill another person. This was quite the interesting predicament, and it was very enthralling to see the way that everyone slowly but surely started leaning towards pulling the lever. The first girl just cracked under the pressure, but it was the second guy who left shortly after that did so because he could hear the statues moving behind him. Initially, he seemed on board with what Sung Jin Woo was saying, but the moment those statues started inching their way closer again was the moment he lost faith in everyone else and decided to save himself. This left only 4 now, but among those 4, 2 very important variables were present now. The first was Sung and the respect he'd earned by helping everyone survive, while the second was the indisputable fact that anyone could escape to safety now. This begged the question of faith versus survival again, which to Mr. Kim was something that he needed assurance on. You see, yes, Sung's theories may have been backed with multiple trials and various observable evidence, but the idea they would survive this trial now still wasn't 100% guaranteed. So, to Kim, who wanted nothing more than to survive himself, the certainty of his own survival outweighed the possibility of survival for the entire group, leading him to run, but not before that half-hearted thanks which fueled Sung's rage. This wasn't shown in the anime, but it was in the manhwa that Sung would look like this as Kim ran away from them. He was essentially cursing his name for him having betrayed them. Now, The remaining 3 would discuss who would be left behind, and it was a surprise to find out that in the novels, Sung had actually considered Juhee. That's not to say that he was planning to follow through on it, but he did consider it an option just like all the others. If he did somehow choose to follow through on it though, then Sung knew he would have hated himself for the rest of his life. I mean, not only had she saved his life numerous times before, but the only reason she couldn't move now was because she had used all her mana trying to heal him again. So, as Sung would leave with Juhee in hand, it wouldn't be accurate to say Sung was satisfied being the only person left, but he also wasn't upset since he knew what could have been. What I mean is that even if he did make it out missing leg and all, his new life as a cripple wasn't one he could foresee himself being happy with. He wouldn't be a hunter and he wouldn't be able to get a job, so had he made it out, he wouldn't have been able to support his family the way that he wanted to. At least by dying, his mother and sister would get the $300,000 life insurance payout from the Hunter Association, a generous offer considering it was far more than what he was worth as an E rank. The rest was Sung getting tossed around like a ragdoll, which, just so you know, was a lot more lengthy in the anime. But yeah, that's pretty much it for episode 2. I decided to include a bit more details from the manhwa, so if you like that and all the stuff left out from the novels, let me know in the comments so I can continue to do it like that. Hopefully this video was able to provide something new for you. The next video will be out around the same time next week, but if you want to know exactly when, then feel free to subscribe with notifications on. There's plenty more solo leveling videos that I plan on doing for you. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!